This is the Enjoyer Podcast. I'm your host, James Dixon. One of my favorite things to do on the Enjoyer Podcast is to talk to fellow enjoyers, to talk about their stories, to talk about some of the things they've learned and they've brought us. So one of my favorite enjoyers here, Mitch Miller, is my guest today. Mitch, we're going to start you with the question we start everybody off with. What do you enjoy about Michigan?
Well, there's a lot to enjoy in Michigan. I would say my favorite experiences so far have been the outdoors and the wilderness. There's a lot of great activities in Michigan. And I come from Ontario. The wilderness is not unique to Michigan, but Michiganders really know how to exploit and thrive in their natural environment.
Okay.
And it's a real pleasure to be able to tag along with people, whether it's fishing or motorcycling, who have a great sense of exploration, risk-taking, and adventure.
Absolutely. You know, I kind of have a two-parter on this one. Whenever I talk to a fellow enjoyer, it's a little different because, you know, I think the project we have here is so unique, where you get to write about exactly the stories you want, exactly the way you want. So I'm sure people look at this and say, man, I'd like to get in on that. I'd like to learn how to enjoy the way I'm seeing depicted in these stories. If you see someone, you know, if someone reads us and they have that yearning in their heart to join in some of these exploits that you see and that you've been writing about, how would you advise them to get started?
Well, I think, you know, there's quite large communities surrounding every activity. It's not hard at all to be a novice and an amateur in something. So far, I've found that if you're interested and show a little bit of curiosity, people in Michigan are willing to help you out and show you the ropes. So there isn't much of a barrier to entry.
Curiosity.
Just do it.
Yes, curiosity. Absolutely. One of my favorite stories involved you and Charlie LaDuff. I've known Charlie for many years. He was one of my first mentors in journalism. But what I thought was interesting is that you actually met two journalists in that story, and they presented very differently. You meet the British journalist at a Trump event, and he's jaded. He doesn't look up to any writers. He doesn't read any writers. He's not really into the business. The computer is essentially writing the part of his story that's not already pre-written when he shows up. He has no native interest in what he's doing, and he's paid to be there. Then you have Charlie LaDuff, who wasn't being paid by any news outlet at that point. He's a wolf. He's as independent as it gets. And this is a guy who's still, he was in kind of journalism jail at that point with his legal situation. And he still laced up his gym shoes, went to the scene of a crime that he was writing about, and actually ran it out and compared what what he found on that trail versus what was being claimed in court. Talk about the two different journalists you met, and how do people wind up in that different of places?
Well, I think I alluded to this in the piece. One person is a journalist simply by nature of their title.
Yeah.
And if tomorrow their LinkedIn was deleted, they would cease to be a journalist. It's simply a job. It pays their bills. And once the shtick is over, they're no longer really a journalist.
Right.
Whereas someone like Charlie, there's something essential about him where it doesn't matter what people call him. It doesn't matter if he's publishing with a reputable publication or running his own thing. He's always digging and excavating, and he will never be a different way.
He can't be.
Charlie is a real journalist, and he's a real storyteller. And so there's, you know, at the heart of it, journalism is an umbrella term. There's lots of different people. There are information disseminators. You know, you have your legacy journalists who simply repeat what they are told.
Right.
But the bigger divide is this spiritual distinction, and someone who actually cares. Right? And they care about the truth, even at the risk of losing fans, of being slandered. It's the truth above all else. And that's what I found made Charlie so interesting compared to this other journalist who I think was jaded because he had this spiritual disease where he knew that he had more or less sold out. He had more or less entered a field with the enthusiasm. Every kid who leaves J school has, big hopeful eyes.
Absolutely.
And then 20 years later, he is a, hired propagandist. And it's not a sexy propagandist either. There's nothing romantic about it. It's not like Thank You for Smoking, where you're spinning these very interesting tales. There's no PR cog that you're involved with. It's just putting your name on prefabricated stories and hitting enter to his editor. And so that's kind of what I was alluding to in that piece and what made Charlie so interesting.
How does a reporter get to that jaded place? If you could hop inside that guy's head, was this someone who did have hopes and dreams and see himself as something else at some point? Is this a guy who made a compromise? Excuse me. Or is this a guy who's doing exactly what he signed up for and it's just not fulfilling?
I mean, I'm sure there's different ways in which journalists arrive at that position. My sense is that no one enters the field thinking that they will become, spin doctor isn't the right word because a spin doctor is having some influence, but rather a vehicle for someone else's information. He's the meat vehicle for what someone else tells him to say.
Right.
I think it's a slow process, and it's a process probably of compromise. And, something that is inherent to all journalism, all storytelling is going to be a friction between what the journalist sees and his or her conscience, and also a friction between what he says and his editor, and a friction between what is published and the audience.
Right.
And through a series of compromises, I think a journalist can end up in a state like the British correspondent I spoke with. And although, it can be very annoying to deal with these sort of combative and unsubordinate types like Charlie,
Right.
The value they have is that they refuse to compromise for anything.
Yes.
And so long as you maintain in yourself this kind of like steadfast commitment to telling the truth, that I think that's what prevents you from ending up in a situation like so many others.
I was just going to ask that question in reverse with Charlie. If you could hop in his head, Charlie's no spring chicken. Charlie's about to be 60. He's still lacing up the shoes. This guy won his Pulitzer years ago. He has a career's worth of accomplishments. He doesn't need to do a thing. He could do his podcast and write columns on his own website and be just fine. But he continues to push these limits. Why?
I can't speak for Charlie. I think if you were to ask him, the Pulitzer doesn't really mean much to him. It's another accolade. It's a few people who've decided that, he did a job well done. But like so many people who are either like true artisans or obsessives, it's always on to the next thing.
Yeah.
And, sitting back and relaxing in, the trophy room, at the end of the day, it's a piece of paper.
Right.
And Charlie doesn't care about the piece of paper, nor does he seem to really care about establishment prestige. And if the establishment wants to celebrate his work, great.
Sure. Yeah.
He'll take it. If they decide that he is now an enemy, a conspiracy theorist,
right wing,
a right wing, which I mean, he certainly is not.
No, he's not.
He's just as happy to continue to his own beat.
Yeah. You describe yourself as a conflict journalist. Tell us, what is that? Who are some others to be aware of? How does one become a conflict journalist?
So I would probably qualify and say I'm more of a conflict writer than a journalist.
Okay.
I don't report on things alone. I will allow myself, and on occasion, this is a good thing. At other times, it's a bad thing. But the flexibility of giving insight, to speculate, to theorize about things. Most conflict correspondents or journalists are simply kind of like cameramen who use words instead of pictures.
Okay.
They tell you what they
Right.
saw. I, on the other hand, will play around with people's motivations and try and understand what's undergirding a conflict.
Yes.
Very basically, what a conflict writer to me is someone who goes where there's friction. That's it. Where there's friction. It can be international, it can be domestic. And to distinguish the writer from the journalist again, I would say that the writer looks for sociological or anthropological explanations for why things are happening.
Right.
They don't have a simple political black and white agenda. They don't want to simply describe the events as they occur. They're curious about what's animating the friction.
See, and right there, the journalist would say, I don't have to hop inside that person's head. I just go talk to them. You'll talk to them, but also hop inside their head.
Yes. And hopping in someone else's head requires naivete. You have to be willing to suspend all your prior judgments. You have to be willing to go in with very, very open eyes, but you also have to not let yourself get consumed inhabiting someone else's mind, to know when to step out of it.
Right.
So there's a bit of a balancing act. Because at the end of the day, I think as writers, you want to be able to make a judgment about a situation. What's good and what's bad. But before you can say that, you have to know what you're talking about too. And if you get too seduced by the romanticism of someone else's mindset, you can also lose your own point of reference. So that's where you're more like a funambulist and, less like a pundit or a commentator. You'll have to sit down with people who others would think are evil incarnate and try and understand their perspective. And then go sit with their enemies too, and be able to empathize to a degree where you can appreciate why they do the things that they do.
Yeah, I once heard it described as, can you describe that person, that cause, in the terms they would use for themselves? You don't have to agree with it, but do you know it well enough? And so I was fortunate, having, they're grown up now, 18, but for several years, a stepkid who was growing up. And my thought always was, if I could explain it to them, then I get it. And if I can't, then I don't get it. What's your read on the Michigan media market in general? What I see, I was at the Detroit News for 10 years, and I see many cases where someone might have a 20, 25-year career, but they've done the same year 25 times. I see numbers, but not necessarily the toughness or the experience that you'd want with it. I see kind of a lazy mind that accepts the narratives that are given. I see busybodies more interested in setting agendas than informing their readers and spelling names right. What do you see?
Well, I think I know my own limits enough to say that commenting on the Michigan media landscape is not something I can really do honestly. What I could say more generally about media at large, and especially journalism, whereby you have very big bureaucracies in charge of news, a lot of people are more concerned about their job than anything else. And they will do the least amount just to secure paycheck after paycheck and extend the contract.
Right.
And part of the reason, I think, is that, there are lots of reasons, I think, why that happens, but they all sort of arrive at the same point, which is that publications have stopped hiring people with massive balls.
Right.
And to be a really good truth teller, you have to be willing to stand against the entire crowd. You have to be able to fight against consensus. You have to be willing to be hated. And it takes a very rare type of individual who can do that. And as soon as all these other concerns come into play, you lose the spark of what makes it special.
Right. You had another great piece on the site. It was called Why Protests Happen. I have two theories on this. One is just simple boredom. A lot of these kids are losers. But two is pressure. I remember, you arrive on campus. I got to U of M in the early 2000s, and you go to a place like the Union, and you see these great black and white photos of the great protests of the years of old. And there can be this feeling that that's how you make your mark on the campus, by joining them, by changing the campus through protests. And so I see a lot of perverse incentives at play that get the young mind out there protesting rather than educating themselves, rather than having fun with a lot of hot girls running around on campus. What do you see?
Yeah, so, if I'm permitted disagreement, I would think that a lot of them are not actually losers in the way that an older generation might conceive these people to be. They often have jobs, they're in school, many of them are quite social, have, girlfriends and boyfriends. There's a lot going on in the kind of protester zeitgeist. I think on the one hand, you have a group of people who are spending a lot of time on social media, and they are in some way politically disembodied. They're always commenting, they're always consuming media, and they never feel as though they're playing an active role in politics other than through kind of vicarious experience.
Yeah.
And so the protest for them is a chance to feel grass on their feet and, physically hold something and imagine themselves as having an influence. The irony, of course, is that most protests in liberal democratic society are little else than pressure release valves.
Right.
They're very contained. They're very boring. These are not like the protests that were going on in American campuses from the 70s and 80s. They're quite restrictive and they're quite conservative in their own behavior. They're quite rule obliging as well. Another thing, I'm not too sure how deep we want to get into this question. My next piece, my plan is to write precisely on this sort of thing because I was at the DNC and I was fraternizing with all the, different shades of protesters.
Right.
Is that the protesters, if you look at political discourse, in some ways, the parameters are set by the most extreme groups, the most permitted extreme groups. So you have people perhaps furthest to the left who, are self-proclaimed communists or anarchists. They adhere to equality, to open borders, to anything that fights hierarchy. Furthest to the right, perhaps, I would say that what's permitted, and even then it's tenuously permitted because these people are constantly attacked, is a nationalist fervor, a sense of reclamation, autonomy, the desire not to be controlled by a group of people whose interests are alternative to your own.
Right.
And so you can get a good sense of what the American zeitgeist is like by interacting with these extreme poles. And even though it describes a lot of American discourse, it also reflects something that's massively wrong, which is that there is something of I'm not going to go as far as say a mental illness, but like a psychic agitation in all the protesters. And what they've done essentially is they've turned politics into something that is closer to theological salvation or redemption. It has religious connotations to them.
This is 50 years of the personal as political.
Mm-hmm. Yes, certainly. And it's also when you lose a sense of the divine, and I'm speaking somewhat metaphorically here,
right.
Most people are not comfortable existing in the void that's left after that. And so they have to find another form of divinity or another God. And for a lot of people, politics replaces that religious instinct. And so what they end up doing is turning their like local political leader into something that's closer to a prophet and not a representative.
Right.
And they see that if only some policies were enacted, my life would be great and perfect. Whereas in reality, I think there are so many personal problems to many individuals that politics is way downstream, but they've put all their eggs in this basket.
I think that that's why they spend their time on politics, because the more time I spend changing the world, the less time I spend on the man in the mirror.
I agree.
Yeah, so I see this coming from this really negative place of, yeah, I think the one positive thing to happen, I think lockdowns were terrible, 2020 was a terrible year, but I think the one positive thing we did have is a chance to answer, who am I without stupid sports games on TV all the time? Who am I without the schedule and the routine and the bar to get drunk at? Who am I? Faced with the mirror.
And when you have an event which is genuinely catastrophic, like COVID restrictions, you find that there are people like you who show that reflection and are able, both to have a opinion on politics, but also recalibrate their personal life. And then there are some people who lose themselves entirely in the debate.
Right.
And sometimes they never come back out of it too. And there's a kind of mania. You can talk with people, whether they are, so support and trusting the science, or people who think COVID was organized by an extraterrestrial conspiracy to steal one's vril. There's all sorts of ideas out there. It's less the thinking and more the mania. You can see it when you speak with them.
Yes.
And I'm not too sure how that resolves. I know to see it. It's like a diagnosis without a cure.
Right.
That doesn't mean a cure doesn't exist, but it's something that, at least in Western politics, we're eventually going to have to deal with. And if it doesn't resolve, the natural conclusion is further conflict.
Well, you noted that in the piece, great piece, people should read it, Why Protests Happen. You noted that the students wanted to remain anonymous, generally, masked up, trying to protect their futures. Whereas organizers, they have a different incentive. They want the notoriety because they want to protect their futures. Because if I can be seen as making this kind of protest, so obviously that means I'm effective at organizing people. But should the fact that I'm wearing a mask not signal to the college kids that I'm playing different games with different rules and different prizes than the people organizing this, and that perhaps that means my feet are in the wrong place?
Well, let me ask you a question in response. I think one of the great changes that Twitter or X has allowed for is the anonymous poster. And the anonymous poster you can think as a form of a digital mask. You have people who are employed by strict administrators who would fire them if they were to find out their political opinion or even their open skepticism. And so what anonymity allows to some degree is a chance to put forward an idea without receiving the whip or the dismissal. And it has been good in many ways because, the anonymous whistleblower has no doubt exposed a lot of things going on in organizations. At the same time, it does permit for people to escape without repercussion, without responsibility. So I'd be curious to know what you think about that. Of course, these protesters are wearing masks. They don't want to be known. But simultaneously, there's a lot of people, and especially people on the right, who feel as though, the Overton window is very narrow. It's more narrow when you're working for someone with even stricter guidelines than what's allowed publicly. And anonymity is a great chance to speak truth to power.
The anon goes back to the earliest days of American history. I mean, where there was a physical safety issue at play, right? Where me saying I thought America should be independent of Great Britain could cost you your life. Obviously, we have cancel culture. I mean, people talk about mean tweets and stuff like that. A century ago, people who did not want to join their union, their labor union, were being killed. People would go to your house and kill you. Abolitionists have been killed for publishing tracts. So I think anonymity makes sense when you consider the ultimate context. Is there a violence that could result from this? Is there a cancellation that could result from this? Could it change my financial, material well-being? But I would say in the case of the college protester, that's entirely a regime-backed activity that you're partaking in. So what is the fear? And in the case of the right, I say, what exactly are we afraid of? Like, okay, because to me, you can only be canceled once.
I think what's interesting, and I'm in agreement with you, that permitted discourse usually sides on the left-wing regime. But when you talk to people who are the same ilk as the protesters, they also think that the regime is their enemy. And they think that the regime is, the establishment is actually a conservative or a neoconservative operation.
Really?
And they think that if, Trump is elected, there might be reprisals. So there's equally a fear of something hovering above them, right, some sort of threat. But more palpable, I think, is there's a great fear in America of one's neighbor. And these political protesters are less worried about being fired or being sent home from school. They're worried about someone who is online in their neighborhood who gets spazzed out and commits violence against them or their family for a belief that they have. And I don't think it's so easy to put that aside. I think there is a huge fear of civil conflict in America, and it's not necessarily organized. It's not done by reasonable people.
Right.
But it makes something like the phone book seem like a massive anachronism.
Oh, yeah.
Your phone number and your home address. And that seems crazy to people today, precisely because of that fear.
We've come a long way with that. I mean, I remember at the Detroit News, one of my favorite things to do was look at the archives. And so I found a story from 1956 where a policeman had been fatally shot in Detroit. They caught up to his parents. He had been adopted. They actually printed the address of his parents. Today, you couldn't even say Crossroads. You could barely even give a town, or else they would say that you're not back in the blue and you're putting lives in danger. And I get like so much more of a high trust society. This was 70 years ago. That man had been actually killed, and you could print that address. And it was common of the people who were quoted in newspapers that their entire address be given, not just the town they're from. I could not imagine asking people right now, okay, you just gave me a great quote. No one likes to talk to the newspaper per se, but you did. You gave me a great quote. Let me ask your address, which will be printed, by the way.
This is exactly it. It's not necessarily the fear of the regime or being fired. It's when you have the loss of a high trust society, everything is sort of precarious. You have no trust in anybody.
These are the days when anything goes.
It's you exist in a similar mental model as the paranoid schizophrenic.
I remember probably almost 15 years ago at this point, I was going out with a candidate in Ann Arbor area for school board, and they were knocking on doors in Scioto Township. So we're out there in little rural ass Scioto Township. No one cares about Scioto Town. And anyway, we're knocking on doors, and these people are like, a good amount of the people wouldn't even like come outside. They'd talk to you through the window or something, but like, do you really think I came all the way to Scioto Township to take everything you have? But they thought that, or they thought some version of that. And this was, long before Black Lives Matter or anything. And I'm just like, I remember being struck by, what are you afraid of?
Right. And I think if you look at several other metrics, it would point to the same direction. Parents allowing their children to take public transportation,
Yes.
leaving valuable goods outside, uh, negotiation, taking phone numbers or responding to phone numbers that are unknown. It all
Kids
points
walking
to the
themselves to
sense that,
school.
if you're like me, someone who actually rather enjoys being in chaotic third world countries, you'll know that every interaction has suspicion behind it. Getting a taxi is always a battle between being scammed and getting a good deal. And as we enter that phase of paranoia, things start to look more and more like a failed state.
I find what you just said fascinating because it actually ties into a third story that you wrote that I love. MSU is tracking you. So supposedly in response to this mass shooting, MSU brings in the entire surveillance state. Cameras are rolling. AI is running to interpret it. So I would feel safe getting a cab here because it's an Uber. It's a Lyft. There's information about my driver. It's all trackable. It's all GPS. I feel surveilled enough, not high trust enough, but that it's high risk enough for you to do something to me in that case. Is lack of surveillance really our problem?
Surveillance is a natural response to something like that. The irony is that it's very difficult to argue for freedom and high trust when rationally, for the sake of self-preservation or for the sake of, I'm not too sure what would be the kind of instinct here. It is a self-preservation instinct, but if there are porch robbers in your neighborhood, people will naturally put up home video recording devices. If you move into a neighborhood where there is higher crime, you're more likely to track your children through their cell phones if that's available for you, because it gives you a peace of mind. And so what you're seeing with this kind of community surveillance is just a externalized version of the personal surveillance that people are doing all the time as well, or the familial one.
Right.
And unless you can address the reason for why the bad things are happening, the loss of freedom seems like a small concession for the peace of mind.
And then we learn when something bad happens, when we have a bad day in September 2001, what just happened in Israel last October, some of the best security states we've ever seen, then have the unthinkable happen. And I just, what comes after the security state? We've agreed to this to be surveilled. They can they can see what books you checked out of the library. There's cameras following you everywhere you go, license plate readers. The next 9/11, what do we do then?
So you could have, you're asking me questions where I'm going to have to kind of get into hypotheticals here. But in a tyranny, perhaps like many would call China, where you have a functional bureaucracy, surveillance can be used for all sorts of social manipulations.
Right.
I almost think that is a optimistic alternative to what America faces, which is surveillance in a totally incompetent bureaucracy where people think that, they have this safety blanket that will mean something. But, just as we have a quote unquote police state, which, is thrown around regularly, if someone breaks into your car or into your home and you call the cops and they arrive 30, 45 minutes late, what use is that police state or that surveillance?
Yes. And I feel like that's kind of what we are faced with. And I feel that what does come after the surveillance state is the police state, is we got to hire 500,000 more. We got to, that kind of thing where now because there's a dynamic that was kind of unearthed during COVID, I believe, which is you can't arrest us all. and I think plans are being made in case they need to arrest us all, especially after we saw after January 6th. I mean, all that, tracing people down from a whole weekend of transactions. I mean, it's out of control. Mitch, what would you have people know about yourself? Where can people find your work?
Oh, they can find me on The Enjoyer at Mitch Miller. I'm also very happy to come along for any sort of adventure or extreme exploration. If there are any like divorced men with, disposable income who don't have the buddies to go do something dangerous with, my email is available under my articles. So
what kind of danger might you all find together?
That's it. I mean, I won't try and set limitations on it. Whatever is intriguing and exciting, so long as it takes place in Michigan.
Absolutely. The open-ended nature of that I find fascinating. I hope your email box fills up because I want to read more stories from Mitch Miller. Mitch, I want to thank you. I know you're in Greece right now. You've taken so much time out of your day. Thank you, Mitch.
Well, thank you for having me on. It's been a real pleasure.
Appreciate you.